There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or a shared blanket on a worn-out sofa, and they slip past your defenses. You don't recognize their weight until much later, when you trace the map of your life and find a single, indelible point from which all the roads diverged. For me, that moment was not a grand declaration or a dramatic event. It was a question whispered into the quiet space between one breath and the next. It was a question that came from Julian, my best friend, the person who had occupied the center of my carefully constructed universe for years, and it landed with the impossible, earth-shattering softness of a feather. We were on my couch, a familiar geography of cushions and worn fabric, entangled in a way that had become our new, unspoken ritual. The low light of the television flickered across his face, catching on the edge of his jaw, the curve of his ear. His head was resting on my chest, a comforting, terrifying weight, his arm draped loosely over my stomach. It was a pose of such profound intimacy that it made the air in my lungs feel thin, stolen. For months, this had been our language, a dialect of touch and proximity that I was too afraid to translate. And then, he shifted, just enough to tilt his head back and look up at me, his eyes dark pools of reflected light in the dim room. His voice was a low murmur, rough with sleep. "Leo," he'd said, "my name is simple, solid thing in the quiet." And then, the question, "How do guys usually touch you?" The words hung there, suspended in the space between us. They weren't flirtatious. They weren't suggestive. They were clinical, curious, an inquiry from a researcher studying an unknown species. And yet, they were the most intimate words he had ever spoken to me. My entire body went still, a landscape frozen under a sudden sheet of ice. Every point of contact between us flared into significance. The warmth of his cheek through my shirt, the solid line of his thigh pressed against mine, the casual weight of his hand. How guys usually touched me. The answer was a barren, desolate thing. They didn't. Not like this. Not with this aching, unnameable tenderness. My history was a collection of fumbled encounters and loud bars, fleeting connections that evaporated by morning, touches that were grasping, not giving. There was no usually, there was only the before, and there was this. There was Julian. But I couldn't say that. To say that would be to confess everything, to detonate the delicate ecosystem of our friendship. So I did what I always did. I observed, I analyzed, and I gave him a carefully edited photograph of the truth. To understand the weight of that question, you have to understand the foundation it threatened to shatter. You have to go back to the beginning, before the couch, before the unspoken rituals, before the tectonic shift in the landscape of our friendship. Julian and I met in the way that many people do in the strange, self-contained biosphere of university, through a shared wall. I was a photography student, a creature of shadow and silver halide, my life measured in f-stops and shutter speeds. My room was a cave of quiet concentration, smelling of fixer and stop bath, the windows often blacked out so I could work. I chose it for its solitude, for the way it buffered me from the noise of the world. And then Julian moved in next door. He was the antithesis of my quiet existence. He was the star of the university swim team, a being of pure kinetic energy, of chlorine and sunlight. His life was loud. It was the percussive thump of a bass line through the drywall at 2 a.m, the laughter of a dozen people spilling out into the hallway, the slam of a door followed by the sound of him taking the stairs 2 at a time. He was a force of nature, a summer thunderstorm raging just on the other side of my carefully constructed piece. For the first month, I knew him only as a collection of sounds, a disruptive energy I resented with a quiet, academic fury. I would lie in bed, listening to the muffled cadence of his conversations, trying to develop photographs in my head while the beat of his music vibrated through my mattress. He was an inconvenience, a variable I hadn't accounted for in the controlled experiment of my life. My first actual sight of him was anticlimactic. I was heading out with my camera bag, a heavy, cumbersome thing, and he was coming in, dripping a trail of water down the linoleum hallway. He'd just come from the pool. His hair was dark and slicked back, and his skin seemed to radiate a humid warmth. He was wearing nothing but a pair of swim briefs and a towel slung around his neck, and he moved with an unconscious grace that was almost startling. He was all long lines and defined muscle, a body built for a single, powerful purpose. to cut through water with maximum efficiency. He was like a piece of classical sculpture come to life, and I, the quiet observer, the student of form and light, simply stopped and stared. My photographer's brain cataloged the details, the way the harsh fluorescent lights of the hallway carved shadows under his collarbones, the beads of water clinging to his eyelashes, the faint, clean scent of chlorine that hung in the air around him. He noticed me staring. A slow grin spread across his face, utterly devoid of self-consciousness. It was a wide, brilliant thing that seemed to generate its own light. "Sorry about the mess," he said, gesturing with his thumb back at the puddles he was leaving. "Practice ran late." I could only nod, my throat suddenly dry. I felt intensely aware of my own form. All sharp angles and muted colors, bundled in a dark jacket, hiding behind my heavy camera. I was the negative to his positive, the shadow to his light. "You're Leo, right?" he continued, shifting his weight. "I'm Julian. I'm pretty sure my taste in music owes you about 40 hours of sleep." The apology was so disarmingly genuine that the fortress of my resentment crumbled in an instant. I managed a small smile. "It's fine," I lied. "I'm mostly nocturnal anyway." That was the beginning. It was an opening, a door cracked open between our two separate worlds. From then on, the sounds from his room were no longer an anonymous disruption. They were Julian. The thumping bass was Julian, back from a meet, celebrating with his team. The cascade of laughter was Julian, holding court, the gravitational center of his social orbit. And slowly, impossibly, that orbit began to pull me in. It started with small things. He'd knock on my door to borrow milk, or to ask if I had a bottle opener, and he'd linger for a few minutes, leaning against the doorframe, talking about his day. He was fascinated by my photography. He'd peer into my room, his eyes scanning the prints pinned to my walls, stark landscapes, abstract studies of light on water, candid street portraits of strangers. He didn't just look. He saw. He'd point to a photo, a black and white shot of rain on a pane of glass, and say something like, "It looks like the city is crying." He had a way of cutting through the technical jargon and finding the emotional heart of an image, a skill that both surprised and disarmed me. Our friendship was an unlikely architecture, built piece by piece in the hallway between our rooms. He would tell me about the grueling pressure of competitive swimming, the endless pursuit of shaving a millisecond off his time. He spoke of the water as if it were a living entity, a worthy adversary and a constant companion. I, in turn, found myself talking about my work, about the magic of capturing a moment, of freezing time in a frame. I tried to explain the feeling of watching an image emerge from the chemical bath in the darkroom, the slow ghost of a face or a landscape appearing on the blank paper. It was like witnessing a memory being born. He listened with an intensity one hadn't expected. He was used to a world of clear metrics and decisive victories, and the quiet, subjective alchemy of my art seemed to captivate him. He was the sun, and I was the moon, and somehow, we found a way to share the same sky. The first time he saw my darkroom, it was a revelation for both of us. It was a small, windowless closet I had converted, and the air inside was thick with the sharp, metallic scent of the developing chemicals. Under the single, eerie red safe light, the familiar contours of the world vanished, replaced by a landscape of deep shadows and crimson highlights. I was working on a series of portraits, and I was in the middle of the delicate process of agitating a tray of developer. Julian stood in the doorway, a tall silhouette against the light of the main room, silent for a long moment. The red light stripped all the bright color from him, rendering him in monochrome, like one of my own photographs. It made him seem both more real and entirely mythic. "This is where the magic happens, huh?" he whispered, his voice hushed with a kind of reverence. I nodded, my eyes fixed on the tray. "Something like that." He stepped inside, pulling the door almost closed behind him, plunging us into the deep, ruby-tinted gloom. He didn't speak again for several minutes. He just watched as I moved the print from the developer to the stop bath, and then to the fixer. He watched as I finally turned on the main light, and the image was revealed, stable and permanent. It was a portrait of an old man I'd met on the street, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and stories. Julian leaned in, his shoulder brushing against mine, the contact sending a small, electric current through me. "Wow," he breathed out. "You pull things out of the dark." He didn't know how right he was. I had been pulling him out of the darkness of my own solitary existence, developing an image of him in my mind that was becoming dangerously vivid, dangerously precious. That was when I knew I was in trouble. The affection I felt for him was changing, deepening, shifting from the stable bedrock of friendship into something more like a fault line, a place of immense pressure and potential upheaval. I started seeing him not just as a friend, but as a subject. I would watch the way light caught in his hair after a run, the unconscious grace of his posture as he read a textbook, the sheer, unadulterated joy on his face after winning a race. My mind was constantly composing shots of him, framing him, trying to capture the elusive essence of his vitality. But I kept my camera pointed elsewhere. To photograph him, to turn my lens on him in that way, felt like a confession. It felt like admitting that he had become more than a friend, that he had become a focal point, the object on which my entire world was trained. And that was a risk I was unwilling to take. Our friendship was a delicate, beautiful thing, a rare species of connection I had never experienced before. I built walls around my feelings, reinforcing them with the bricks of our platonic history. He had a girlfriend, Sarah, a bright, bubbly girl from the business school. Their relationship was a constant, solid fact that served as the primary buttress for my defenses. Julian would talk about her easily, openly, and each mention of her name was a painful, necessary reminder of the boundaries. I became the confidant, the stable, reliable friend, the one he came to for advice or just to vent. I learned to live in that role. I learned to cherish the specific, circumscribed brand of intimacy it afforded me. A hand on my shoulder, a casual hug after a big win, leaning against each other while watching a movie. These were the acceptable forms of contact, the common currency of our friendship, and I hoarded every single one of them like a miser, analyzing them later in the quiet of my own mind, trying to extract more value than they actually held. I was a cartographer of platonic affection, meticulously mapping the borders to ensure I never, ever trespassed. I told myself it was enough. For years, it was. The shift, when it came, was not a slow erosion but a sudden, violent earthquake. It was the end of Julian and Sarah. It wasn't a dramatic, explosive breakup, but a slow, sad fizzle. They had been together for almost 3 years, and their lives were simply pulling them in different directions. Sarah was taking a job in another city after graduation. Julian was hoping to go pro, a path that would keep him tied to the training facilities here. It was a practical, adult decision, but it left him gutted. He showed up at my door the night it became final. It was late, past midnight. I was listening to music, cataloging negatives, when I heard a soft, hesitant knock. It was so unlike his usual confident rap that I knew something was wrong before I even opened the door. He was just standing there, in the sterile hallway light, looking utterly lost. His shoulders were slumped, the usual vibrant energy that radiated from him completely extinguished. He looked like a photograph that had been left in the fixer for too long. The bright parts faded, the contrasts washed out. "Hey," he said, his voice thick. He didn't have to say anything else. I could see the wreckage in his eyes. I stepped aside, a silent invitation. He walked in and sank onto my couch as if his bones had suddenly turned to liquid. He didn't speak for a long time. He just stared at the opposite wall, at a large, framed print of a lone, skeletal tree against a white sky. I made him a cup of tea, a gesture that felt both deeply inadequate and like the only thing I could possibly do. I set it on the coffee table in front of him. He didn't touch it. I sat down in the armchair across from him, giving him space, creating a buffer zone of air and quiet between us. I was prepared to sit there all night, to be a silent witness to his grief. My own feelings were a confused, treacherous tangle. A part of me, a selfish, shameful part, felt a flicker of something like hope, a terrible light in the darkness of his pain. But it was overwhelmed by the profound, simple ache of seeing my friend so broken. The person who was usually a supernova of confidence and laughter had collapsed into a black hole of sorrow. Finally, he spoke, his voice raspy. "It's over. For real this time." "I'm sorry, Julian," I said, and the words felt like small, smooth stones, inadequate to fill the chasm that had opened in his life. He finally looked at me, his eyes glistening. "What am I supposed to do now, Leo? Everything was planned. You know? The next few years, they were a picture in my head. And now it's just blank." It's a blank piece of paper. His use of my own medium, my own metaphor, was a small, sharp blow to the chest. A blank piece of paper. I knew that feeling, the terror and the possibility of it. He spent the night on my couch. He didn't ask. It was just an unspoken assumption. I gave him a blanket and a pillow, and when I went to my own room, I left my door slightly ajar, a habit I developed for no reason I could articulate, perhaps just a subconscious signal that he wasn't alone. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sound of his ragged breathing from the other room. It was the first time the architecture of our friendship felt like it was fundamentally changing, the walls shifting, the doorways resizing. He was no longer just a visitor in my space. He was a refugee, and my quiet apartment had become his sanctuary. That night was the beginning of the new ritual. The ritual began subtly. Julian started spending most of his evenings at my apartment. He said he couldn't stand the quiet in his own place, the way it was haunted by the ghost of his relationship with Sarah. My apartment, with its scent of chemicals and coffee, its stacks of books and quiet music, was a neutral territory. It was a space without memories of her. At first, the old rules of our friendship still applied. We'd watch movies, or I'd work on editing photos while he read, or just stared into space. We kept a careful, respectful distance. The couch was a continent, and we were on opposite shores. But grief is an ocean, and its tides are relentless. It pulls people together. The first time he crossed the space between us, it was almost by accident. We were watching some mindless action movie, a cascade of explosions and car chases that required no emotional investment. He had been quiet all evening, a heavy, dense presence beside me. Midway through the film, he just listed sideways. His head came to rest on my shoulder, a dead weight. My entire body tensed. It was a simple gesture, something friends did, something he had even done before in passing. But this was different. This wasn't a fleeting, casual touch. It was an act of surrender. He was too exhausted to hold himself up anymore. I sat there, rigid as a statue, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was a bomb disposal expert, and this was the most delicate wire I had ever had to handle. I could move, shift away, and re-establish the boundary. Or I could stay still and accept this new, terrifying proximity. I chose to stay still. I let him sleep. I sat there for over an hour, long after the movie ended, the only light in the room coming from the television's relentless menu loop. I studied the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the slow, even rhythm of his breathing. The weight of his head on my shoulder was both a burden and a blessing, an anchor holding me in this moment of excruciating, beautiful tension. That was the first crack in the dam. After that, the water began to pour through. The couch was no longer a continent. It became an island we shared. Every night, he would end up leaning against me, and every night, I would let him. It became our new normal. The initial terror on my part slowly subsided, replaced by a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety and a deep, overwhelming tenderness. I was his anchor, his human buttress against the storm of his own sadness. I told myself that was all it was. He was using me for comfort, for the simple, uncomplicated warmth of another human body. It wasn't about me, Leo. It was about the service I was providing. This was the narrative I constructed, the story I told myself to keep my own hope in a locked, light-proof box. But the ritual kept evolving, escalating in its intimacy. One night, he was particularly distraught. He'd seen Sarah with someone new, a casual coffee date that had sent him spiraling. He came to my place, his face pale and drawn, and he couldn't seem to settle. He paced my small living room like a caged animal. When he finally collapsed onto the couch, he didn't just lean on me. He curled up, tucking his long legs onto the cushions, and twisted his body so he was facing me, his head finding its now familiar place on my chest. And then, he reached out and draped his arm over my waist, his hand resting on my hip. The contact was electric. Through the thin fabric of my shirt, I could feel the warmth of his palm, the slight pressure of his fingers. This wasn't an accident of gravity. This was an act of choice. He was holding on to me. My mind went into overdrive, analyzing the gesture from every possible angle. It was a gesture of a child seeking comfort, a desperate plea for security. It was a gesture of a lover, a casual claim of ownership and affection. It was a blank space, a void of meaning that I could fill with either my deepest hopes or my most profound fears. I lay there, my body a contradiction of tension and feigned relaxation, my breath carefully measured. I was a landscape photographer pretending to be a mountain, hoping the man taking shelter on my slopes wouldn't notice that I was trembling. The air in the room was thick with unspoken things. His grief, my longing. They were two powerful, invisible gases, mixing in the small space between us, creating a volatile, potentially explosive atmosphere. I was terrified he would hear the frantic, irregular rhythm of my heart beneath his ear. Surely he could feel it, the frantic bird trapped in the cage of my ribs, beating its wings against the bone. But he said nothing. He just breathed. His breath was a slow, warm tide against my chest, rising and falling, and after a while, I found myself matching my own breathing to his. Inhale, exhale. We were two bodies, breathing as one. In that moment, the fear was still there, a cold stone in my gut, but it was wrapped in a layer of something else, something warm and soft. It was the simple, profound peace of being exactly where I wanted to be, even if it was for all the wrong reasons. This ritual became the central pillar of our evenings. He would arrive, we would talk, and then we would migrate to the couch and fall into our established configuration. It was a silent, choreographed dance we had invented. My apartment, once my solitary fortress, had become our shared space, a sanctuary for two. The lines blurred. His toothbrush appeared in my bathroom. A change of his clothes lived in a small pile on my armchair. He was seeping into the corners of my life, his presence becoming a permanent fixture in the landscape of my home. And I, the careful archivist of my own solitude, did nothing to stop it. I was an addict, and he was my drug, and I was incapable of refusing the dose he offered me each night, even knowing it was a temporary prescription for his own pain. The nights he didn't stay over were somehow worse. I would lie in my own bed, in the profound silence of my apartment, and feel the phantom weight of his head on my chest, the ghost of his arm around my waist. The quiet I had once cultivated as a necessary condition for my work now felt like a profound and aching absence. He had recalibrated my definition of silence. Before it was peace. Now it was just emptiness. He had ruined my solitude, and I was pathetically grateful. It was during one of these nights, deep into the era of our ritual, that he asked the question. He had been especially quiet that evening, a thoughtful, introspective mood I hadn't seen in him before. The raw, desperate grief had started to recede, leaving behind a more contemplative melancholy, like the quiet, gray light after a storm has passed. We were on the couch, of course. It was late. The city outside had fallen into a deep hush. He was tucked against me, his breathing slow and even. I thought he was asleep. I was tracing the patterns on the ceiling with my eyes, my mind adrift in the familiar sea of my own complicated feelings. The hope was a dangerous current, pulling me out, and the fear was the undertow, trying to drag me down. Then he shifted, tilting his head back to look at me. His eyes, even in the near darkness, were clear and focused. There was an unnerving lucidity to his gaze. He wasn't looking at me as a source of comfort, as a piece of furniture. He was looking at me. "Leo," he said. And then, "How do guys usually touch you?" My world stopped. The question was a scalpel, slicing through all the layers of ambiguity and plausible deniability I had so carefully wrapped around us. It was a question that demanded a truth I had never spoken aloud to anyone, let alone to him. Usually, the word was a joke. My romantic and physical history was a series of disconnected, unsatisfying anecdotes. It was a short, poorly written book. There was no usually, there was the awkward fumbling in the back of a car in high school. There was a handful of forgettable, whiskey-fueled nights from my early university years, encounters that were more about friction and loneliness than genuine connection. The touches had been impatient, seeking, demanding. They were touches that took, they didn't give. They were nothing like this. Nothing like the patient, trusting weight of him against me. Nothing like the absent-minded way he would sometimes trace patterns on my arm while we talked. Nothing like the feeling of his hand resting on my hip, a simple, solid point of contact in a spinning world. How could I explain this to him? How could I explain that his platonic comfort was more intimate than any romantic touch I had ever known? How could I explain that he, in his grief and his presumed straightness, had accidentally shown me a tenderness I had never believed I would experience? To tell him the truth would be to say, No one has ever touched me like this. You have ruined me for anyone else. It would be a confession of love disguised as an answer to a simple question. And so I hedged. I constructed a fiction. I built a plausible, unremarkable history that wouldn't betray the truth of my feelings for him. I cleared my throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. I don't know, I said, my voice strained. It's different. Sometimes it's just faster. More intentional. I was speaking in code, trying to describe the graceless, goal-oriented touching I had known without sounding pathetic or inexperienced. I was trying to paint a picture of a life that was not my own. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. He was processing my words, turning them over. I could almost see the gears turning in his mind. Intentional, he repeated, the word a soft puff of air. Like, for a reason. Yeah, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Like, leading somewhere. He nodded slowly, a small, thoughtful movement. And then he did something that shattered my composure completely. He took his hand from my hip, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was pulling away, that my answer had somehow broken the spell. But he wasn't pulling away. He was repositioning. He lifted his hand and placed it gently on the side of my neck, his thumb coming to rest just below my jawline, in the sensitive space right behind my ear. His touch was featherlight, tentative. It was a touch of discovery, not possession. His thumb began to move in a slow, deliberate circle, a tiny, hypnotic motion against my skin. Every nerve ending in my body caught fire. This was not the touch of a grieving friend seeking mindless comfort. This was different. This was intentional. It was the exact opposite of the impatient, grasping touches I had tried to describe. It was slow. It was questioning. It was a sentence without a period, a thought left hanging in the air. He was recreating what I had described, but he was doing it through a filter of his own innate gentleness, translating my clumsy description of fast and intentional into this unbearably tender exploration. Like this, he whispered. I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. I could only nod, a tiny, jerky movement. The frantic bird in my chest was going to break my ribs. He was mapping my skin with his thumb, and with each slow circle, he was mapping the uncharted territory of what we were becoming. It was no longer about comfort. It was about curiosity. It was about him, for the first time, seeing me not as a stable, comforting presence, but as another man, a body with its own history, its own responses. He was conducting an experiment, and I was the subject, and I was terrified of the results. He continued the slow, torturous caress for what felt like an eternity, his eyes never leaving mine. The air was so thick with tension, I felt like I could have developed a photograph in it. And then, as slowly as he had started it, he stopped. He let his hand fall away from my neck, but he didn't move it far. It came to rest on my chest, right over my heart. He had to have felt it, the wild, panicked thrumming. He tucked his head back into its usual place against me, as if the experiment was over, as if he was returning to the safety of our established ritual. But everything had changed. The unspoken had been given a voice, a physical vocabulary. He had asked a question, and then he had answered it himself, not with words, but with a touch that had redrawn the map of our entire relationship. He fell asleep a few minutes later, or pretended to. But I lay awake until the first gray light of dawn began to creep into the room, his hand a warm, heavy weight on my chest, a silent testament to the line we had just crossed. The aftermath of that night was a study in silence. The question and the touch that followed had created a new kind of tension between us, a high-frequency hum beneath the surface of our interactions. It was as if we had both seen something we weren't supposed to see, a glimpse into a room we weren't meant to enter, and now we were both pretending we hadn't. The ritual continued, but it was different. It was freighted with a new self-awareness. When he curled up against me on the couch now, I could feel a new hesitancy in him, a new consciousness in his touch. It was no longer the thoughtless, desperate clinging of a drowning man. It was the deliberate, careful touch of someone who knows the object he is holding is fragile. And I was more aware than ever. Every point of contact was a question mark. Every shared silence was a loaded pause. We were orbiting each other in a new and dangerous way. The kiss, when it happened, was not a sudden collision but a slow, inevitable decay of that orbit. It was a week after the night of the question. A week of this heightened, unbearable sensitivity. It was another late night, another movie flickering unwatched on the screen. But this time, something was different. The air was still. The usual melancholy that clung to Julian seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a quiet, focused intensity. He wasn't leaning on me for support. He was just there, close. Our shoulders were pressed together, our thighs aligned. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at me. I had been trying to focus on the movie, using it as a shield, but his gaze was a physical force, pulling my attention away. I finally turned to meet his eyes. The look on his face was one I had never seen before. It was a mixture of apprehension and resolve. It was the look of a man standing on the edge of a high dive, knowing he is about to jump. He didn't say my name. He just kept looking at me, his eyes searching my face, as if seeking permission or forgiveness. The silence stretched on, a taut wire pulled between us. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The anxiety, the fear, the constant internal debate, it all fell away, replaced by a simple, profound sense of inevitability. This was it. This was the moment the fault line finally gave way. Then, he spoke, and his voice was so low it was almost inaudible. "Leo," he said, his voice rough. "Would it be okay?" He didn't finish the question. He didn't have to. The two words were a universe of meaning. Would it be okay if I kissed you? Would it be okay if I destroyed this perfect, fragile thing we have? Would it be okay if I admit that I need you in a way I don't understand? My own answer was not a word. It was the slight, almost imperceptible nod of my head. It was the closing of my eyes, a gesture of complete and total surrender. I was done fighting the current. I was letting it take me. The space between us diminished with excruciating slowness. I could feel the warmth of his breath on my skin before I felt his lips. It was a hesitant, tentative contact. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a question in physical form. His lips were soft, uncertain. It was an exploration, a moment of discovery. It lasted only a few seconds, but it contained a novel's worth of emotion. Years of unspoken affection on my part, months of confused, burgeoning need on his. It was the quietest, most earth-shattering event of my life. When he pulled back, the space he left was cold. I opened my eyes. He was looking at me, his own eyes wide with a kind of shock, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had just done. A universe of possible futures balanced on that single, silent moment. And then, the fear crashed back in, not mine this time, but his. I saw it flood his face, a wave of panic and confusion that erased the tender resolve that had been there moments before. He had jumped from the high dive, and now, he was terrified of the water. He scrambled off the couch, moving so quickly he nearly knocked over the coffee table. He stood in the middle of my living room, running a hand through his hair, not looking at me. He was a tightly coiled spring of panic. I'm sorry," he stammered, the words tripping over each other. "I shouldn't have. I don't know what. I have to go." And then he was gone. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the armchair, the one that had become a permanent fixture in my apartment, and fled. The sound of my apartment door closing behind him was like a gunshot in the silence. I was left alone on the couch, in the flickering light of the television, my lips still tingling from the ghost of his kiss. The fault line had ruptured, the earthquake had struck, and I was left standing in the rubble, utterly alone. The world hadn't ended, but mine had. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. It was a silence that was not empty, but full. It was filled with the echoes of his panicked apology, the slam of the door, the ghost of his touch. My apartment, which had become our shared sanctuary, reverted to being my fortress of solitude, but the walls no longer felt protective. They felt like a cage. He didn't call. He didn't text. My own messages to him. First a tentative, "Are you okay?" Then a more direct, "We should talk," went unanswered. They sat there in my phone, two blue ticks of confirmation that he had seen them, that he was actively choosing to ignore me. The unknowing initiator had become the terrified fugitive, and I was the scene of the crime he was fleeing. Each passing hour of his silence was a fresh layer of torment. My mind, my greatest analytical tool, became my enemy. It constructed elaborate scenarios, each one more painful than the last. The kiss was a mistake, a moment of grief-induced madness. He was disgusted with himself and with me. I had been nothing more than a convenient, warm body, a temporary stand-in for the female comfort he had lost, and in one moment of confusion, He had taken it too far. I had misinterpreted everything. The tenderness, the question, the way he looked at me. It was all a projection of my own desperate longing. I had built a cathedral of hope on a foundation of sand, and the tide had finally come in. The pain was a physical thing. It was a dull, constant ache in my chest, a hollowness that even food couldn't fill. I stopped working. The darkroom, my place of creation, felt oppressive. I couldn't bear to look through the lens of my camera. The world seemed flat, colorless, devoid of interesting light or shadow. All the beauty I had trained myself to see was gone, eclipsed by the gray misery of his absence. After 5 days of this radio silence, something inside me broke. The hurt and the anxiety curdled into a hard, cold knot of anger. It wasn't just my heart he had broken. He had broken our friendship. He had taken this precious, beautiful thing we had built over years, and he had shattered it with his own confusion, and then he had run away, leaving me to clean up the pieces. He didn't have the right to do that. He didn't have the right to detonate a bomb in the middle of my life and then refuse to even survey the damage. The quiet observer, the man who lived behind the lens, decided he had to step into the frame. I had to force a confrontation. I had to have an answer, even if it was the one I dreaded most. At least the truth, however painful, would be a solid thing I could hold on to. The uncertainty was what was killing me. I went to his apartment. It felt strange, crossing the campus to his building, a journey I had rarely made. He was always the one who came to me. His space was his, mine was ours. As I stood outside his door, I felt a tremor of fear, but the anger was stronger. I knocked, my knuckles rapping against the wood with more force than I intended. For a long moment, there was nothing. I was about to knock again when I heard the sound of the lock turning. The door opened a few inches. He was standing there, looking even worse than I felt. He was pale, there were dark circles under his eyes, and he was wearing the same sweatshirt he'd had on 3 days ago. He looked haunted. The sight of him, so haggard and miserable, momentarily extinguished my anger, replacing it with a fresh wave of that old, familiar ache. But I held my ground. "Julian," I said, my voice steady. "You don't get to do this." He flinched, but he didn't open the door any wider. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Leo, I can't." "You can't what?" I pushed, my voice rising. "You can't talk to me? You can't answer a text? You can't look at me? After everything? You kiss me, and then you treat me like a stranger? Like I did something wrong." "You didn't," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the floor. "It was me. It was all me. I'm sorry. I don't want your apology," I said, and my voice cracked with the sheer force of the emotion I had been suppressing. "I want to understand. I deserve that. Our friendship deserves that." The word friendship seemed to land on him like a physical blow. He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were filled with a desperate, miserable confusion. "I don't know what it is anymore, Leo. I thought I did. It was the one thing in my life that was solid, the one thing that made sense. And I broke it." "You didn't break it, you idiot," I said, the frustration making me bold. "You ran away from it. There's a difference. Now are you going to let me in? Or are we going to have this conversation in the hallway for all your neighbors to hear?" He hesitated for a second. Then he stepped back, pulling the door open. I walked into his apartment. It was a mess. Clothes were on the floor. Empty food containers were on the counter. The air was stale. It was the space of a person who had given up. It was the complete opposite of the ordered sanctuary of my own apartment. I turned to face him. He was standing by the door, his shoulders hunched, looking like a defendant awaiting his sentence. "Talk to me, Julian," I said, my voice softer now. The anger had burned itself out, leaving only a vast, aching sadness. "Please, just tell me what happened in your head." He took a deep, shuddering breath. He walked over to his own sofa and sank into it, burying his face in his hands. His voice was muffled when he finally spoke. "I don't know. For months, after Sarah, you were just there. You were my anchor. You were the only thing that felt safe. And I needed that. I needed to just hold on to something that wouldn't break." He looked up, his face etched with self-loathing. "I used you, Leo. I used your kindness, your patience. I just took and took." "It wasn't like that," I said quietly. "I was there because I wanted to be." "But you didn't sign up for that," he said, gesturing vaguely, referring to the kiss. "That night, when I asked you that stupid question, I don't even know why I asked it. It just came out. And you answered, and I was looking at you. And for the first time, I don't know, It was like a switch flipped. I wasn't just seeing my friend. I was seeing you. And it scared the hell out of me. He let out a harsh, humorless laugh. And then I kissed you. And for about 3 seconds, it felt right. It felt more right than anything has felt in a very long time. And then the panic hit. Because it's you, Leo. You're my best friend. You're the one good, stable thing in my life. And I'm a mess. I break things. I broke things with Sarah. And I thought, I'm going to break this too. I'm going to break him. And I couldn't stand that. So I ran. His confession was a torrent, a chaotic, messy flood of all the things he had been holding back. It was everything I had feared and everything I had secretly hoped for, all at once. He was confused. He was terrified. But he had felt it too. The rightness of it. It wasn't just me. It wasn't a projection. It was real, and it was mutual, and it had scared him into hiding. I crossed the room and sat down on the coffee table in front of him, so we were face to face. You think you're protecting me by disappearing? I asked gently. You think this is better? Me, sitting in my apartment for 5 days, thinking I was some kind of freak, some experiment you regretted? Thinking I had imagined everything? That's not protection, Julian. That's just cruelty. Tears welled in his eyes and began to track down his cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. I know, he whispered. I'm so sorry, Leo. I'm so sorry. I don't know who I am right now. I thought I did. I had a whole plan, a whole picture of my life. And none of it included this. Feeling this. For you. And there it was. The truth, finally spoken aloud. Feeling this. For you. It was a messy, terrified, reluctant confession, but it was a confession nonetheless. All the anger, all the hurt I had been carrying, it all just dissolved, washed away by the raw, painful vulnerability on his face. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man, lost and afraid, grappling with a truth that had upended his entire world. I reached out, my hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before I placed it on his knee. A simple, solid point of contact. An anchor. Okay, I said, my voice soft but firm. So you don't know who you are right now. That's okay. You don't have to know. But you don't get to run away. Not from me. We figure it out. Together. He looked at my hand on his knee, and then back up at my face, his expression shifting from one of despair to one of fragile, tentative hope. It was like watching the sun break through the clouds after a long storm. He nodded, a slow, solemn movement. He didn't have any more words, but in that moment, we didn't need them. We had found our way back to a shared language, not of ritual and ambiguity, but of honest, terrifying, beautiful silence. The conversation in his apartment was not an end, but a new beginning. It was the demolition of the old, precarious structure of our friendship and the laying of a new, more honest foundation. There was no magical, instantaneous resolution. The days that followed were quiet, tentative. We were like two people learning to walk again after a long illness. We had to rediscover how to be around each other, now that the truth was out in the open, a living, breathing thing in the room with us. The first step was him coming back to my apartment. He knocked on the door that evening, and the sound was different again. Not the confident rap of the old Julian, not the hesitant tap of the broken Julian, but something in between. A question. I opened the door, and we just looked at each other for a long moment. Can I come in? He asked, his voice quiet. Always, I said. That night, we sat on the couch, but we sat on opposite ends, like we had in the very beginning. The space between us was not a chasm of loneliness, but a space of respect, of giving each other room to breathe. We talked for hours. He told me more about the slow unraveling with Sarah, about the pressure of his swimming career, about the feeling of being adrift. And I, for the first time, talked about my own loneliness. I told him about the quiet, observant life I had built for myself, and how he had crashed into it like a beautiful, chaotic meteor. I didn't confess the full depth of my years-long affection. That felt like too much, too soon. But I admitted that my feelings for him had become more than friendship long before he had started sleeping on my couch. It was a conversation of mutual confession, of stripping away the layers of assumption and projection. We were two photographers, finally showing each other our undeveloped negatives, the secret images we had been hiding in the dark. When it grew late, a new, unspoken question hung in the air. Where would he sleep? The couch ritual was a relic of a time of denial and ambiguity. To repeat, it would be to retreat. I stood up. Come on, I said. my heart starting to beat a little faster. You can't sleep on that thing forever. It's bad for your back. I led the way to my bedroom. My room was as minimalist as the rest of my apartment. A bed, a small desk, and walls covered in more of my photographs. It was my inner sanctum, a space he had rarely entered. I pulled back the covers on one side of the bed. I didn't say anything else. I just made the offer, a silent gesture that spoke volumes. He stood in the doorway for a second, his expression unreadable. Then he walked in, and we got into bed, keeping a careful, deliberate space between us. Lying there in the dark, side by side, was more intimate than all the nights of cuddling on the couch combined. That was a performance of comfort. This was a conscious choice. This was real. Leo, he whispered into the darkness after a long time. Yeah. Is this okay? It was the same question he had asked before the kiss, but this time it held a different meaning. It wasn't about permission to take something. It was about ensuring comfort, about mutual consent. It was a question born of care, not confusion. It's okay, Julian, I said, and my voice was steady. It's more than okay. I felt him relax beside me, a slow release of tension. A few minutes later, I felt his hand find mine under the covers. He didn't grasp it. He just laid his palm against mine, a simple, warm connection in the dark. And we fell asleep like that, not tangled up in a desperate search for comfort, but simply existing, side by side, two separate people choosing to be together. The new normal was built from small, quiet moments like that. It was the morning coffee we made together in my kitchen, moving around each other in an easy, domestic dance. It was him watching me work in the darkroom, no longer as a curious outsider, but as a quiet, supportive presence. It was me going to his swim meets, not just as a friend, but as something more, something undefined but solid. I even brought my camera. I started taking pictures of him, finally allowing myself to turn my lens on the subject I had wanted to capture for years. I photographed him in the water, a blur of motion and power. I photographed him after a race, exhausted and triumphant. And I photographed him in the quiet moments in my apartment, reading on the couch, the afternoon light catching in his hair. He was no longer a secret subject. He was just Julian. And my photography was no longer a confession. It was a celebration. We learned to talk. We learned to name the things that scared us. We learned to replace the ambiguity of touch with the clarity of words. The physical intimacy returned, but it was different. It was intentional. A kiss was a kiss, not a moment of madness. A handheld was a statement, not an accident. The cuddling on the couch came back, but now it was an expression of joy, not a cure for sorrow. It was a celebration of closeness, not a defense against loneliness. There was a beautiful, honest silence that grew between us, a silence that wasn't empty, but full of understanding. It was the silence of two people who had navigated a storm and found a safe harbor. It was the silence of home. One evening, months later, we were on the couch in that familiar, comfortable tangle. His head was on my chest, his hand resting over my heart, which was beating in a slow, steady rhythm. Everything was the same, and yet everything was different. The low light of the lamp cast a warm glow over the room. He was so quiet I thought he might have been asleep. Then, he spoke, his voice a low rumble against my ribs. Hey, Leo. He paused, and for a second I felt a flicker of the old anxiety, the fear of the unknown question. But it vanished as quickly as it came. That was part of the past. We were in the present now. Thank you, he said, simply. For what? I asked, my hand coming up to rest in his hair. He was quiet for a moment, and I could feel him thinking, searching for the right words, a habit he had learned from me. For not letting me run away, he finally said. For coming to get me. I tightened my arm around him, pulling him just a little closer. The memory of that night, of his desolate apartment and his tear-streaked face, was still vivid. It was a photograph etched in my mind, but it was no longer a painful one. It was the image of our turning point, the moment the quiet observer had finally stepped into the frame and changed the composition of his own life. It was the moment I had chosen to fight for the hope, instead of surrendering to the fear. We had found our way out of the dark, not by ignoring it, but by walking through it together. We had learned that the most profound moments of connection are not always the loud, declarative ones. Sometimes, they are as quiet as a whispered question on a Tuesday night. They are moments that arrive disguised as something ordinary, but they hold within them the power to redraw the entire map of your world, leading you, finally, to a place you can call home.